So, yes. So what I want to do here is share what I had thought about for what we've been calling participatory system mapping. And this is what was in my mind at the time I wrote the proposal. I think that it's not been as central to our discussions, partly because the way I had envisioned it, it lived partly in the simulation and partly in the qualitative domain. And so I think that has meant that it's not central for either one. And so it feels kind of like a side thing. I don't see it as a side thing, and I'd like to share with you why. So just to remember the notion of boundary objects that we discussed near the beginning of the project as a term that facilitates communication, that object can be pretty much anything. It's akin to the people feeling the elephant and beginning to describe what they have. And one of the things it does is it creates shared vocabulary, even if people's understanding, perception, use in their discipline, even if all that stuff differs, it's something to talk about and to bring people together. And so in our project, this notion called paradigm of change is treated as a boundary object. And one of the reasons that I like it as a boundary object is that paradigm of change, even if it isn't called that, it's inherent in many disciplines. Let me stop here and just say that if anyone has questions as I'm talking, feel free to interrupt. I'd rather take the questions as we go along so things can be clarified. And so I wrote this into our project, partly because it combines a couple of things that I really like. Now, that may be a dangerous thing to do, is like just put it in a project because you like it rather than because it's the appropriate method. But anyway, that's what happened. So the first thing that I really like is system dynamics. And I'll try to be clear about what I like. It's not like I'm a system dynamics expert. System dynamics has been around in engineering since the mid-50s. And it was J. Forrester at MIT was known as the father of system dynamics. And it's basically a set of relationships that can be represented as equations, and it becomes the foundation for simulations. So this is somebody's interpretation of Forrester's world dynamic map. And that word dynamics means how and why systems change over time. And the ability to simulate systems that are changing and incorporate, especially some of the feedback loops, has been incorporated into software packages, of which I think the most famous is VenSim. And so you can buy a package where you can plug in the equations or make little graphical maps, and it'll model how this changes over time. The part of dynamics that I really like is it's something that was taught in mechanical engineering. Many of you who are engineers have probably seen this too. The simpler systems can be analyzed in terms of equations, and then they have characteristic behavior of time evolution, and you can get into transfer functions, positive and negative feedbacks. I just kind of like the equations, and I like how kind of everything can be represented. So it kind of tickles my engineering intellect, I guess. And then you can use Laplace transforms, so, on the simpler systems, you can do a bunch of stuff like that. And the simpler dynamics are used in electrical and mechanical systems, but then they can be applied to the big systems and the big complex systems that we are thinking about. However, at some point they get too complex for you to be able to see the systems, and that's where the simulation comes in. So systems thinking, which is a little bit different than system dynamics because it may not involve necessarily modeling, but just thinking about the system, also leverages what might be known as causal loop diagrams. So the classic systems thinking literature is people refer to Donna Meadows or Dana Meadows, who promoted some of this work, drawing a system map, and especially the idea of understanding the system so you could seek the points of leverage where change would be most likely. And so this figure is showing she identified 12 points that can be leveraged. Constants and parameters that are in the model are kind of the weakest one, but the one that people tend to focus on. And so then there are stocks and flows, and the most powerful one is shifting the paradigm totally. So that idea of causal loop diagram has been used extensively in organizational research, getting people to figure out what's going on in their organization. Some of the key features are, what are the nodes? How are they connected? So not just are they connected, but what's the directionality? What's the sign of the feedback? Is it a positive or negative feedback? And how strong is it? And then occasionally people are able to do time delays, saying that this is going to happen, but not until a certain time after something else occurs. And by occasionally, I mean, it's really hard it's much harder to pick out a time delay or a relationship with a time delay than it is to see direct correlations. So another kind of diagram appears in the practice of interventions. And I just made up this term intervention practice because I don't know what else to call it. I also want to recognize social scientists. Y'all may tell me I'm using the words wrong. Please do so. I probably am. But in education, international development, public health, a bunch of those different kinds of fields, people say, I'm going to do an intervention. And then in order to justify that intervention, they have to present a theory of change. That is, I'm going to provide financial aid guidance, and then these things are going to happen, but here's why. You have to explain why, and people want to see that, so they don't just fund ideas that are thought to be snazzy. However, in my view, and I would love to get pushback from anyone who has seen differently, compared with system dynamic approaches, theory of change tends to lack feedbacks. So that they don't do a full system map, they just show a causality, and it also tends to lack validation steps. Ryan, why don't you just speak up, Ryan? Because it's hard for me to look at the chat and manage everything too. So I'm happy to hear your statement. Are you able to unmute?
Yeah, no, I was mostly, sorry, I'm at the VA, so I had my video off. I was more making a statement that I actually think, like, we encourage people to specify the theory of change, but oftentimes the theory of change is not developed at all. It's like an ideal. And that's one of the things we teach in like program evaluation class is you need to work with this program to understand their theory of change, because we find a lot of organizations don't really have one.
I would agree with that too. So maybe my word often is unjustified, sometimes presented with a proposal, and some proposal calls will demand that you submit a theory of change with your proposal, but that is not always true. And then I haven't ever seen anyone like actually go back and challenge the theory of change and say, have we got it right? And so I feel like it's a thing that people sort of understand, and they use an approximate causal map, but it to me, it tends to be a lot weaker than what's done in systems thinking or system dynamics. Okay, and then the last place, and I'm sure I've missed some, but the last place where you see system mapping occurring, and then I think this is the one where Adam was sharing, although he did cover a number of different approaches, is in the participatory engagement realm. And so I became sort of enchanted with this when I did a workshop on participatory action research. And I thought, man, this is really cool. It looks just like causal loop diagrams or system dynamics. And of course, I wasn't the first one to think of it. It just kind of inspired me in that way. So I'm going to share a sequence of photos that was work done by Danny Burns at IDS, which is the sort of OG of participatory action. And so this is how they conducted that mapping. So they first started with some qualitative work. By the way, as you'll see at the end, this was work on child labor and what caused it. And I've skipped a number of the photos that he shared, but then sort of bringing together the major features, people working to develop connections, and then discussing the connections and talking about calibration, and identifying the appropriate level of detail to share. And then finally, this is what eventually came out of the group after all of that. So my observation is that the paradigm of change appears in some form in many disciplines, and particularly it appears in some form in both engineering and social science disciplines. So that's why I'm interested in it as a connection.
Tami,
Yeah.
maybe I'm going to address this. So far, the way you've presented this, it sounds like you're presenting PSM of participatory engagement as an alternative or another view of systems thinking, the system dynamics, systems thinking, participatory engagement. But to me, the first two are how we think about a problem in terms of its dynamics, how it changes over time, including feedbacks and thinking about causation.
Mm-hmm.
But the participatory engagement you then show, to me, is kind of an orthogonal thing. It's almost like that's one way that you can come up with your view of what the system is and what the dynamics are. And it's just about engaging people who are affected by those systems to help think about how they view the system. So
Yes.
it's almost, I mean, you can have, instead of Danella Meadows or Jay Forrester coming up with those system dynamics diagrams, maybe you have stakeholders and people trying to do that themselves.
That's right.
Right. So,
That's right.
Okay.
Right. And so the participatory engagement that I showed is actually not very different from what is done in organizations. And so there is a quantitative component to it in terms of the modeling, but both the systems thinking where people apply it in organizations and say, okay, what's going on here? That is pretty much the same method that's applied in participatory engagement, except that, well, no, maybe this is not true. The engagement is getting people to think about what's happening, but also bringing forward what is happening for people who may not understand the system. Right. So I think that's the engagement is bringing people in to talking about the system and having them perhaps come forward with possible solutions. But the other thing that it does is make some of the connections clear to people who are not familiar and not immersed in the system, so that they have a better understanding of how it works for those people. I don't know if that addresses your question or statement.
Well, kind of. I mean, what does it have to do with paradigm of change? It's just one way to source the paradigm of change. To think,
Correct.
right? It's not a different view of the paradigm of change.
No, it's not. Yeah, it's not meant to be a different view. Is
Okay.
that, yeah, what I'm saying is that it's common. It's a common element. It's not really a different view.
Okay.
Yeah, so one thing I do want to say is that simplifying the map is a really important task. So this book on systems mapping brought this forward, and they said this is typical of one of the things that people do wrong. They call it a horrendogram. And so basically you can map all the connections. Yeah, you're not meant to have to read these, but the complexity is acknowledged. But what this does is it makes people throw up their hands and go, oh, well, gosh, never mind. I don't even know where to start. And so how you deal with a complex system in terms of winnowing it down without losing the critical connections is a really important part of this process. And so you want to do it in the case of engagement, you want to do it respectfully, because you don't want people to feel like their input has been disregarded or is not important. But at the same time, you can't, the human brain and the computer model are both incapable of understanding and grappling with and identifying change points in something that's extremely complex. So that's a challenge, right? The more you put on, the more so-called realistic it is, and the less tractable it becomes. Okay, so then, yeah, sorry.
Can I ask a quick question just
Yeah.
about so I think one of the tensions here, and Simla's comment made me think of it, is there's an assumption that like the participatory mapping is going to represent the system of change. And I think there's a pretty robust like implementation research and public policy that says people in programs often don't understand how their programs work. And there's like the internal belief about how the program works and the actual belief, and that participatory map might not show the way the system really functions. And I don't know what to do with that, but I think it's a tension we should keep in mind.
Yeah, so this is where I want the group to discuss. So I only have a couple more slides. So my underlying hypotheses in this project, which I didn't put forward as hypotheses, but they just led to me doing what I did, is number one, the paradigm of change that is a boundary object that can be used to help disciplines align. Everybody has some version of it. And so it's not like you have to introduce a new concept. You can rely on what they already know. And now, as you point out, Ryan, people may see things very differently, but those differences are frequently not acknowledged. So the paradigm of change, it's my second hypothesis. If it is made explicit for different groups, it can represent fundamental differences in what people think the system structure is, and that would lead to significant differences in the projected outcome. So who might differ in their paradigms of change? So promoters of the change narrative, people who are doing scenarios, people who are using those scenarios, home occupants might have a different paradigm of change, government actors, people who actually bring about the physical change they might all see that paradigm of change differently. And so, Ryan, I think inherent is in your comment, like people don't understand how their programs work, is the question, does any individual or group of actors actually understand how change works? Right? So I'm not asking the question, whose paradigm is right? I'm saying, I think we all see it differently. And that includes the people who are implementing those paradigms in models and saying, this is what will happen. So how would we forget whether we've got it right? One of the first things that I'd like to demonstrate is that they do differ and would have different outcomes. And I don't know exactly how to do that. And so here are my drafty ideas. Let's say we had maps from different groups that were confined to those groups. So there are tools from network theory, which I do not know very well, describing nodes, connections, and strengths. And so you could compare using those tools between average maps from different groups and also variability within groups. Now, I will say that the tiny amount I've done of delving into network theory tends to describe the nodes and the connections. It doesn't do very well with directionality or strength. So it's like these things are connected and this network is different because these other things are connected. But I haven't seen a lot that deals with a causality within the network. So the other idea I have is just find a way to easily put these diagrams in a simulation and compare what would happen between the outcomes and the trajectory, the evolution along the time axis. And that could be it could end up being a very silly exercise. Like, look, these things are all different, except that somebody's paradigm of change is in the models now. And we don't know whether that one is correct either, or we are assuming that it is correct because it's got some kind of validation on a very high level. Okay, so that is how I'm thinking of system mapping for this project, using it as a boundary object to understand how people think about change differently. And that includes the people who are doing the modeling itself. How different are they from the people who are engaged in change in different ways? Okay, so that's it. That's all I wanted to say about it.
So this group, the promoters of change narrative, is the paradigm of change that they're using the one that you're saying is currently in place, whether or not they are able to articulate it. That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
And that's something that hasn't been mapped or made explicit already. So we don't really know.
As far as I can tell, I think the scenarios tend to have underlying relationships that imply a paradigm of change. And so that's when we've referred to engaging elites to put forward their paradigm of change, it's making that explicit.
Mm-hmm.
I see where you're coming from now, Tami, and I like it. I think, so, if you're taking modelers as a reference point, for example, in the promoters of change narrative, maybe implicit in that is there are modelers, right, who are representing building transformation, right, for example.
Mm-hmm.
One could, and I agree, it's not explicit, what their paradigm of change is. In some cases, it may just be that they are doing what they can, given data availability or whatever. But still, in what they implement, one can reverse engineer what that paradigm of change is.
Mm-hmm.
You have a certain appliance, the price changes, you decide if you're going to buy it. The paradigm of change is, I respond to the price of this product, and that's all that determines whether I change it. Something like that. And then what we would want to do, so I think it's very useful to do this exercise. We haven't done this explicitly. But first of all, what is the locus of our question in any case? What are we thinking about? Whose change are we talking about, right? I think we're talking about building equipment, building energy equipment, perhaps.
Yes. How do changes in homes occur when those 4 changes that have a substantial capital expense and a potential benefit or cost for well-being and climate?
So then it seems that the way we frame the proposal, the way we've been working so far, we are interested very much in trying to characterize how occupants themselves view their own decisions around this. So what's their view of a paradigm of change, right? But
Right.
then we've also talked about, Ryan doing this other survey of other stakeholders, which may be trying to look at how other actors may view this, or I'm not sure what. But it seems a very useful exercise to try to create these maps with causal loops reverse engineered from the models we know, and then maybe implicit in the social science literature around the same questions based on a whole hodgepodge of case studies. And then what we learn from the interviews. Seems to me a useful exercise. It's part of what we're doing as a research output.
Is it okay if I stop sharing so we can see faces better? Does anyone need me to leave this up?
No, it's okay. Hold down.
Okay, now I have to figure out how to stop sharing.
Tami, are you going to share the presentation over email or anything?
I can put it in the, our presentations usually end up linked to the, in the call notes. So yes, it can be done. So the reason I wanted to present this is I think that people have been talking about it because we put it in as a task, but I think I hadn't been very clear on what the underlying reason was, or the underlying ideas. And those are my underlying ideas. It does not mean they cannot evolve as we go forward, or some of them may be pruned. Like, no, that's really not very interesting.
So now how does PSM fit in? Are you seeing that PSM approach as being a way that we try to solicit inputs from either homeowners or other stakeholders in terms of their view of the paradigm of change, or the...
Yeah, so I roughly, and I'd love to hear from Adam on this if he has the bandwidth to do so, and from Ryan. So the current interaction with homeowners is through Chris's interviews. That's kind of feeding or providing inputs or seeds or nodes or something. And it's more, I would say it's less structured than a system mapping event. Now, Adam has been looking at the system mapping. In the proposal, I believe we agreed to start with the elite actor system mapping because it's easiest to get access to those people, and it gives us practice. I think we had, and I don't remember exactly the timing, sometime down the road, what Chris's view would be, or what comes out of the interviews with Chris would maybe be used as a springboard or a basis. We don't really have the scripting down very well, to then engage home contractors or home occupants, and also sometime in the year 3 to 5 period, we would go to engage home contractors. So that was like in our phase 2. I think that's how the timing was written. And so it was meant for us to do it slowly, for it to be a complement to the other engagement that was going on. And to start with the easy thing. Hey, Adam, can I follow up on your comment? You say elite actors is more common in the literature. Do you mean that term is more common, or that the reports are more common? And maybe Adam can samples of, yeah, that's likely. Yeah, so I was really interested in, particularly in contrasting experts with how other people experience change and how they think it works. And as well, I'm not sure that it's helpful to decide who's elite and who's not elite, but I suspect that even program, as you were saying, Ryan, that people who operate programs or who do like delivery programs, for example, everybody involved with the Healthy Housing Coalition, I think they would have a different answer too.
I think, like, going back to the project we said, I think one of my tasks was supposed to be coding Chris's interviews to do like a first take on could we use Chris's interviews to do a system mapping. And that was even before we did a follow-up survey. The idea was we could actually use these semi-structured interviews to get an idea of how homeowners were mapping the system before we did the follow-up survey year 3 to 5.
So Adam, I think we could spend some time on better terminology. I think we just sort of picked stuff. I'm not married to any of these terms. So a little bit of an aside, one thing that I've thought might be interesting is for our group to do a theory of change, not on home transformations, but on the project. Do we think the project will make a difference? And if so, what is our theory of change? I think generally people are not explicit on that. People are just doing this like, well, if we do this, then everybody will listen because we'll have some analysis. It's a very loose theory of change, right? So I thought that could be an interesting exercise for us. Okay, so I guess I'm not hearing any more questions. I want to leave space for that. But so what, QTs, what do you think is next? What's the next step in following up on the system mapping? Sort of now that you know what I intended, I think there's some feeling that now we need to figure out how to do this. Do you think that happens now? Would you like to have a different meeting? What do you think is appropriate?
I'm happy to start on that. I actually felt like after your presentation, like I think there's better alignment than I thought we had before. Just in terms of like, I think we have a human subject script ready that like we could go out to elites, experts, whoever, and invite them and do some participatory mapping. And I think if we did that at the same time that we begin to think like following your and Narsima's idea of like, what does our theory of change look like? I actually think we're generally working in that direction of thinking of like, how do these diverse actors think about this idea in like a coherent manner? But that's my take, because I actually felt better about it.
I have the same impression, Ryan. I think we've talked about having an output be a map from each of those 4 groups. I think we haven't decided on order, priority, or selection process down to like inclusion, exclusion criteria. Like we haven't drilled down on a definition of who would be in the government group versus in a, elite, or maybe those are the same. Anyway, I think we hadn't gotten down to inclusion, exclusion criteria, but I think my understanding of the participatory system mapping, as we've been talking about, is that each of those groups would have a map that was produced.
Yeah, that's my sense too. And I think that's a first step. And then what I see coming from the quantitative side is perhaps some work on being able to characterize and quantify in some way differences, rather than just saying, look at these two, they're really different, being able to talk about those differences in a way that that brings it home, that makes it obvious what differences there are and what influence they have in terms of outcomes that might occur. So one thing
I think one.
go ahead.
How has that been done in some of the examples that you gave? Like the system mapping? And this is my ignorance, I guess. I guess I would assume that some people have developed some methods for comparing maps, like both qualitatively and quantitatively, like number of nodes, what type of node, frequency.
Yeah, and that's where I was saying I'm probably not I haven't gone into the literature in depth, but I have,
Mhm,
but most of the network analyses that I've observed tend to be nodes and connections,
mhm.
not directionality and not strength. And so I would also think that that would be out there, but I'm not confident that it is. So it may need some work.
I think I might have written in the proposal that we were going to try and use structural equation modeling to do that, just because network
Oh,
models
yeah.
aren't very good at it.
You did.
And I think that's still a feasible way to go about it, potentially.
But it's something to work out. Stacy, were you going to say something?
I was just thinking that some folks at CDAC that I work with, just if you want to test out like kind of just an interview or talking to some folks about systems, interviewing them for the purpose of putting together like a systems map, it would be a pretty low key way, I guess, of getting some information that doesn't feel like high stakes because you're not talking to like elite members of your community. But anyway, I guess what I'm offering is that we have a lot of experience working with utilities, providers, governments, people, and providing like advice to lay folks on energy efficiency and renewables. So just if you'd like to interview us, I think that staff members that I work with would be amenable to like, giving you half hour, 45 minutes of their time to talk to you about the way that these systems work, the way that they see them.
Great. Thank you, Stacy.
May I ask a question? How in the home owner or the people you're interviewing, I mean, you're doing interviews individually. Would it be a separate exercise to bring homeowners together to try and do this kind of mapping exercise? Is that what you've been thinking about? And if so, would that be phase 1 or phase 2?
The homeowners or the occupants, I think that was kind of bordering on when we get into phase 2, because it's going to take information from the interviews. Is that your understanding, Ryan? Ellison?
I didn't think we were ever going to do like, so to me, that'd be a focus group. And I don't think we ever proposed that, just because it's a lot harder to get individual homeowners into a room together than it is to at least set up a time with one of them. So I think we only proposed doing individual interviews. I mean, what we proposed versus what we need to do can change though. So if the group decides like, actually, like we need to do some focus groups here 3 to 5, I wouldn't be opposed to that. I think it's just an additional burden on those participants.
I think it could be interesting. I think it's open, and I'd like to see it. Ryan is probably right that it's not in the proposal. But we did definitely talk about doing contractors to see how they saw it differently. One thing that I think the group needs to work out is that you may have a script. I get the sense that in different scripts, there's a sequence, and I haven't seen what that sequence is like, and So in terms of sequence, it seems like there's a brainstorming part, and then there's a collective part where people kind of narrow it down. And I'm being very vague about that because I feel like people have suggestions for how to do that. But I don't feel like I've seen that completely developed how we plan to do that. So I'm not suggesting we do it now. I'm saying I feel like that's open.
I think one thing we could do as far as that is when we had looked into it, there's like a number of like technologies you can use to do this mapping, or you can like have people draw on paper. And if I actually think if we're going to develop that, it would be helpful to trial something like this on our group first, rather than say, oh, we're going to use this technology, but maybe we do, your mapping idea on our group using the technology, and then we change some of the questions to fit what we need to get out for the project. Because like, I think right now we have a list of general questions related to the project, not necessarily like the, how would you connect these two things? They're more just general questions about system that's changed in this area.
Yeah, and then I think, Adam, you had raised the point about you can do it individually, or you can do it more in a focus group style where you get a collective map. And I think my sense is that we have not settled on that decision either. So what do y'all do you how would you envision going forward? Like, I feel like there's a little more maybe another meeting when really the QTs can be there all together on kind of pounding out which things we're going to pick, what sequence we're going to pick, and why. Does that seem reasonable? Or how would you like to see that moving forward?
I mean, I don't want to speak for the rest of the group here necessarily before I chat with them, but I know I had signed up for a presentation time for our Friday meeting in late June. And I was going to talk a bit more about like the selection stuff, which I got to talk about a lot last week with people and get helpful feedback. So one thing we could do is instead like use that to do like a trial of some of these with the group. Adam and Allison, and Chris isn't here, I guess, but if you're like, no, that's a terrible idea, feel free to jump in. But I actually feel like that would be kind of useful just to like try some of this stuff, because none of us has actually done it before.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked it even as far back as the December meeting about doing a mapping exercise amongst ourselves, in part to elucidate our own thinking, but also as a way to practice a method that I think none of us are like super confident in. I think that would be worth doing. I guess this doesn't have to happen in sequence. I think right now, I would like us to have a set of questions that are like, we're going to do it this way or that way, and we make a decision. And either people are indifferent because they don't have, thought or expertise to weigh in on it, and they're fine with us moving forward, or they do want to move forward in a certain way. So the example you gave, Tami, we have talked about potentially doing discussions with small groups of elite actors. Each of those discussions could have a map as an output. Is that a high priority to do it in that way, to gather some heterogeneity within groups? Or does that matter very much? And I don't feel like I know what we want as a group. I think the heterogeneity is valuable. I'd probably advocate for several small groups within each of those larger categories. I also think it might be easier to logistically manage that, but maybe I'm wrong. So I think decisions like that, and I keep coming back to the, inclusion, exclusion criteria, as I'd feel more comfortable going live, knowing that we know why we want people in or out, or like we won't go forward until we have somebody like X, if that, that's a way we think about it. I liked, Ryan, your suggestion of practicing amongst ourselves.
I think that's really valuable.
I think we'd have to do that like upfront, that question stuff before that in some ways though, because I think we'd want to, if we're going to use people's time to practice, like we want to have it like, I think this is what we're going to do, how we're going to do this. So like, I think that'll take some upfront work from all of us, but I think we can probably do it. We just need to put time in together.
Yeah, I'm happy to participate in that too. And then, I was gonna say something, I totally can't remember. Okay. I wanted to address Anne's comment in the chat. Anne says, don't our funders have an idea of how we should influence change? I don't, that sounds really good. And it pretty much never happens. And I think I will say a little bit about that, and I'd love to hear from other people. But there's two things that contribute to that not being the case. First is that the funders that we tend to work with are granting agencies. They're not contract agencies, and grants don't tell you what to do. They can't. That's kind of the rule, is you have a fair amount of leeway. And so typically you have to propose how your work will have an impact. In NSF, this is called broader impacts. And they say that this is an extremely important part of the proposal. It can be more or less an important part of the proposal. In the sciences, I personally think that many people write broader impact statements that are disregarded after they get the money or downplayed. They're not as important. That's just my sense. And I have been on review panels where people have actually said, yes, they have good broader impacts, but we all know it's about the intellectual merit. And the program manager did nothing to dissuade them. And so that's the kind of thing that we're fighting when you really want to have impact. The other thing is, I don't think there is I'm not aware of really strong literature on how what's funded in science or scientific enterprise does influence change. So I think there's work on how public opinion is influenced. But there's not a whole lot that people are playing to about, if you do this project, this change will occur. There's almost nothing. And so you don't get guidance from the funders. Yeah. So anyone else want to comment on that? Everyone's looking perplexed.
Well,
Me
I think
too.
the question I understood was like funders like NSF have an idea of how to influence change. My first reaction is not at all. Like they don't know this field at all. We don't even know this field. I think this isn't a field. This is meant to be a convergence of multiple fields. So I don't feel like they have any idea. Which
Yeah,
is
so I feel like
interesting to
it's
contrast against, say, like a foundation funding work, like Robert Wood Johnson Foundation funding, anti-Black racism housing policy work. Like they have a pretty clearly defined theory of change, and they fund work that fits within that. To me, that sort of sits at another, maybe not end of the spectrum, but another point on the spectrum.
And the thing that perplexes me, I'm really not sure how to respond. When I have a naive view, I mean, I think that we are as researchers trying to discover what is the truth about how people change. There is some truth out there in terms of how different people are motivated to change, and different disciplines have different views about what works. You know, behavioral economists have their own view, focusing on individuals. Sociologists who look at social practice will tell you it's about changing the norms in society. That's what needs to be changed. And similarly, so I don't know, it seems to me we're trying to advance our understanding of some truth about what causes change, not try to figure out different sets of beliefs about it.
That's fair. But anyway, bottom line is, and there's not a playbook. And I think it's tempting to believe that there is, because there's sort of a lot of money floating around and a lot of people who should, in quotes, know better. But there isn't a playbook that I have seen.
It isn't part of that though, that like measuring change is itself like a question of like, we don't even know how to measure this thing. And so having a goal of how to achieve it is itself it's a fraught thing of it's kind of turtles all the way down.
Yeah, which doesn't mean we should not hold ourselves accountable.
No, I think you're right, but I think it means that like, even if like it's an effort in our field to like define what change is, and like there are whole policy journals who like that's what they focus on, is how do we measure change and what do we mean when we talk about change, because I think it's itself a construct that we talk about and we don't actually know what we mean.
Mm-hmm.
I also think we need to develop clarity in terms of what we're aiming to achieve through this process of eliciting different people's views of what changes. So what are we trying to do with it? So we do our own little sort of self-proclaimed expert elicitation, and then we do it with some stakeholders. Then what? What are we trying to do with them? Are we claiming that these are advances in knowledge? We understand better what people think about what it is, but it's not like are we going to test out whether what we come up with is the case in reality? One thing we could do is we could model it. We could claim we have some overlap across different views and we want to model that because we claim that there's some truth to it. But I don't know how scientific that is. Anyway, I don't have any answers, but I'm just really, it's very thought-provoking as to what we're trying to do with this.
Mm-hmm.
I know one thing I'd like to do with it is, like I said earlier, I think I said I was gonna like code Chris's interviews for like to create a system map. But doing that, if we don't have like a ground truth model, is really hard because there's nothing to measure against. And so like in my head, the way I've been thinking about it is like the expert model is the true model, and that might not be right, but like we have to have a starting place to compare like the lay model to. So even if like the expert model isn't like itself like, oh, this is an advancement, to me, it's a useful place as a comparison to how do experts think about this differently compared to homeowners.
Yeah, and I think, pretty soon we're going to be talking about what the meaning of is, right? Yeah, and Anne asks, is there a step of calibrating this model? So I think what we have to do is define what progress in modeling is. Because I think probably everyone's had the experience where you put forward some kind of model or something, and then the answer is like, well, you didn't validate it, or nobody knows this, or this could be anything. Or how do you prove this? And I feel like, and so I have done my past has some atmospheric simulations and some simulations of technology change as it affects emissions. And this is always the question, like, okay, you have a different model. How do you prove it? And I'm challenged by those questions and I respect them. And then I look at all the other models that are out there and they're not proven either, or not proven any better. And so then my question is, well, then why do we keep doing it? Right? Why is it an acceptable thing to do? What do we think that we are achieving? And therefore, what counts as progress? And so the calibrate, what does calibration mean? Or what does validation mean? I don't like the word validation. But what do we count as progress when we're doing simulation, or more broadly, projection or foresight? What's progress in that field? Because I think we've all had, and we've all been the reviewer who's like, you didn't consider like right? Which is an easy way to make nothing get published. I don't either want to fill the literature with unfounded garbage. So somewhere between those two is what we might consider progress. And I think that is a reasonable thing to begin stating explicitly. We consider progress to be the following thing, and we have done it. And I feel somewhat intimidated and dismayed that we are at this point in the evolution of science and society, and people don't answer those questions.
Without knowing really any of them, I'm not a modeler, so I feel a little ignorant here, but two things that come to mind seem to be like, where will we see disconnects and where will we see outliers that are like not within the boundary conditions of the reference paradigm of change? Those seem like I don't know, the maybe obvious is not the right word. They're probably not so obvious, but I think it'd be interesting if you have these four groups of maps and you have nodes that don't appear in each of them. And you can say these nodes appear in these maps and not in these others. That seems like a very useful outcome, especially if there are nodes that appear in maps that are not represented in the current modeling frameworks. And then the others seems to be figuring out, like I guess as you were talking, what comes to mind are these examples from environmental health, where because anatomists in the 1700s had mostly access to bodies from cemeteries that were poor people and usually like lower income or even prisoners, they thought that certain glands looked a certain way. And so when somebody went to the doctor that was middle income and not a prisoner, they said, well, you have this health problem. And they diagnosed a lot of this health problem until they realized that the glands they were looking at were of just a certain segment. But I think the flip side of that is like, if you have the central tendency, which no one is, what variability, what outliers are you missing? And that seems like something that would come out of the mapping exercise that could directly be looked at in the model is like, this would improve the model in these ways, because it would represent something that wasn't represented there before.
Yeah.
Just to build on that, actually, along those lines, what's missing? Because I was thinking back on the literature that I read, a lot of cases people are asking, okay, so why did you change your equipment? And there's a whole bunch of reasons different case studies come up with in different locations. Norway, Spain, Germany, some part of the US. And here we come up with yet another case study in Colorado where this group of people said this is why they changed their equipment. But I think what would be new and what something that was missing is what if we ask a question that has not been asked before. And that's where I think the well-being related questions, how do you view how the energy systems in your home contribute to your well-being? Aside from what everyone assumes is the comfort based on a set point temperature. And so asking those questions, I have not seen those questions asked much in the literature in terms of the modeling, not in terms of the general, of course, the qualitative literature, just asking people about their well-being, there's a lot more there. But in the context of change in equipment and clean energy, how well-being fits in, maybe it comes out of the map, the PSM, maybe it comes out of the interviews. That to me would be progress in terms of how we characterize that. One way.
So it seems to me like the next steps are kind of moving toward being able to do this mapping with the group on a different topic, but just exploring the mapping procedure itself. And we need a little preparation for that. Does that sound right? So some of us might try to get together and prepare that.
Sounds like something that Ryan, Chris, and Adam and I can work on. Is that
Yeah, sure. And I'm happy to be included if you want me.
what's the goal? Goal would be to have made some decisions or made some progress before Ryan, the time slot you have at the end of the month. Is that right? Yes.
That would be my thought, yeah.
Okay.
Which I think we could do because
Yeah.
it would might actually make us get this done. So
Yeah, cool. And then if we're not, if everyone's okay, then we need to discuss the NREL visit. Is it okay to go on to that? Because I think we have a way forward. And then Stacy, do you want to briefly talk about the email that you sent? You said you wanted to talk about it on the meeting, and I think we've got 15 minutes left, so.
I could just say a brief update, I guess. And mainly, so I'm just asking Tami if you could review the 2 letters. It's just 1 page and 1 page.
Mhm.
We're going to move forward with inviting organizations to join a advisory meeting, not like a board or a full board, but an advisory meeting. Ellison and Chris, I think, will be there, and we'll need to discuss just what that agenda looks like. So I'll send out an email to kind of Ellison and Chris and Tami and Taylor soon to get a meeting just between the 4 of us or 5 of us to talk about what that agenda looks like. But we're aiming for this meeting to be around June 28th, I think, is when I sent the invite for, to keep it on the early side so it doesn't interfere too much longer with the interview schedule for recruiting. And the idea would be to ask community members or members of like advocacy groups for feedback based on the recruitment strategies and kind of the qualitative project as it is. So that's just that update. Hopefully we'll move forward with that soon, and hopefully people show up.
Thanks, Stacy.
And I see Tammy, you're putting some stuff in the chat.
Yeah, just a thing that I haven't
and
had to write up yet.
Okay.
The website doesn't say everything they're working on, and she's got, I really enjoyed talking to her, so.
When you
Try
say
that.
she's interested in the system mapping, do you mean as an interviewee?
Yeah. It feels like there's very little overlap between our effort and what they're doing, but then we had some intellectual commonalities when we spoke, and I suggested her contacts participating in system mapping is possibly a way to get some discussion between us. And if you look at their website, it's not really obvious how we connect, but Demetris Stevis from Center for Environmental Justice suggested that I talk to her. So finally I did. So let's go on to the NREL visit. So let's see, two things. I put forward a brief agenda. I shared that with Adam Warren, who is the person who is coordinating our visit. And I didn't hear any feedback other than that. Other than, yes, we're having a meeting. So Adam had said, I'll get his person to put together an agenda. And I said, here's the one that I've shared with our group. And I have had no additional feedback from them. So perhaps that is the one we are running with. I identified possibly slides from people so that we could give a quick overview. Chris sent me one earlier, and I haven't gotten slides from anyone else. What I don't want is very thick slides. I want a little bit about the types of methods we're using and perhaps the questions we are answering. And I would need those pretty soon to be able to get a meeting put together for the meeting on Monday. The meeting is scheduled from 2 to 3. There are at least a couple of people who cannot be there before 2 o'clock. And so what I hadn't realized is that Adam sent me this calendar invitation, and he just meant let's have a meeting sometime this afternoon. And I told everybody, well, we're meeting at 2. And then Adam wrote back and said, oh, and then we could have lunch and we could do this and we could do that. And I had not communicated that to everyone. So the meeting is 2 to 3, but Adam is still open to additional meetings outside of that 2 to 3 block. It does not, that meeting itself is 2 to 3.
And also you can arrive as early as 1:30 for your security screening and everything that's in those details are in the invite that I sent out.
Yeah, we probably should plan to arrive. It depending on how many people are going through security, it can take a while. And sometimes there are bugs in the security where they don't have your name. Voice of experience here. So I guess the questions around this are, first, anything other people want to talk about? Second, if you're not planning to produce the slide, that's okay with me, just tell me, but I need them soon. And third, what might we do, or what might we move forward as additional meetings, or what do people want to propose? Because it's Friday and these meetings are happening on Monday. So now some of you had some thoughts. Do you want to share what you're thinking we should talk about?
Oh, well, before that, I just wanted to ask about logistically Karthik's involvement. So we last time expressed skepticism or concern that we shouldn't have them try to set up a hybrid meeting, maybe too much to ask. So in which case, I guess I should do Karthik's topic and my topic one after the other. So one on the synthetic data that we want to use to understand the human dimensions, and then a little bit on what we're thinking about in terms of decision making in models. So shall I do that on behalf of Karthik, or do you actually want to still try and rope him in?
I think at this time we should not
Yeah, that's what I
plan
thought.
to try to hybridize it, and simply because I'm not aware of the limitations of a government facility in doing
Yeah.
we always run into like, oh, they can't even use Dropbox or stuff like
Right.
that. I would prefer the junior people to be presenting if at all possible. But I guess this snuck up on us. We're not prepared, so we should have done some due diligence before that.
Yeah. Okay, so regarding the content of the meeting, the two things to me I was wondering about is what do we want to get out of it? I mean, we're presenting ourselves, introducing this project, and trying to see potential for collaboration on this human dimension stuff. So that's quite clear. But I don't know these people, but you may be also not sure about what they bring. But to the extent we can figure out if we should be asking particular questions, I'd like, for example, with Eric Wilson, we know exactly the kind of overlap. We know what he does with the modeling. But the other folks, if I should do some homework, I want to know what homework. The only name I know is Adam Warren. So I'm just wondering, in terms of prep, in terms of what we want to get out of the meeting, is there any way to focus a little bit? The second is, I'm just wondering, we are presenting each other's expertise a little bit. Maybe this is already in your agenda, but are we trying to present the project and its goals and where we are, or more just, the different elements of it without a coherent kind of presentation of the entire project? It seems to be more about, I don't know. Is that what you're thinking with our portion of the presentation?
What I was thinking is that I was going to try to take those slides and make them coherent, which is another reason I want them today instead of Monday.
Okay.
And so we don't have a long time to present. And so I really asked for the slides to focus on the methods, but the methods are really a shorthand for what are the things we're investigating and in what way. I find that it's when you go a level down from the very highest level, that it's really the methods or discussing the types of methods that you're using that brings up differences you may have. For example, when I attended that joint meeting, there was a lot of discussion on workforce. It's easy to say, oh yeah, we're working on workforce, but what exactly are you doing?
Agreed completely.
So it's a high level. This is what we're doing and how we're doing it, that allows somebody to say, oh, you are doing something different than what we are doing.
Sounds good. And so in terms of what we want to get out of it, besides, we know Eric and others, we just want to see how things go and see potential areas of overlap. Is that fair? Or should we do some prep on people?
So when I asked Adam how many people were working for him, he said 130, which is shocking to me because I have no idea what they're doing. And so I don't feel able to do a due diligence on that many people. And I'm also aware that most of what people are working on is not public until it's done. And sometimes it's available at the inception stage where they say what they're going to work on. So what I asked them for is, I think in the agenda I put, and particularly around these things, we want to know what you're doing. And that was some from the questions that came forward from this group. But let's go to your bigger question, Narsimha. What do we want to get out of it? So I have two things in mind, and I'd love to hear what everybody else thinks. One, if they have, this is, so the selfish one, the one that's for us, if they have data or platforms that we should be considering, where we would be reinventing a wheel, if we did our own, we want to know that. And we want to have a collaborative relationship of sharing, so that we could consider a joint project instead of one that would be either competitive or I don't know, all the other bad stuff. We would want to be able to consider, should this be a work together instead of a separate work? The other thing is, I would like them to know when they should call us and feel comfortable doing so. So it may be that they've got an open question that they want to pursue, and this does happen. If they know we're working on it, what I would like them to think of us. Just a contact, like we're curious about this, we want to move this project forward. They're not a funding agency, but they do have like seed things where they what do they call accelerator or something. They have little funding for, we want to pursue this topic. So an example of an accelerator, I might be getting that word wrong. An example that they presented during the joint meeting was air quality and climate change. And a lot of people have done air quality and climate change. One of the things they were trying to do is looking at how climate change might influence the potential for renewable resources. So, and I know other people are doing that too, but it's something they took up. They do have an interest in this human dimension work. I don't know what they're doing, so that's what I'd like to know. And that's more on the collaborative side. How do we not reinvent their wheels? But then if they decide to go forward with breaking some ground, could we be included?
That's helpful.
So that's me. Anyone else?
Yeah, I don't know any of these people. I think my understanding of NREL though is coloring my view of what we can get out of the meeting, because since they tend to also apply to the same types of grants that we would, I'm curious how openly they'll discuss what they're doing. I think it would be a shame if we were doing something at a smaller scale that they're already doing at a larger scale and doesn't really contribute to understanding how people make decisions and how well-being factors into that with respect to household energy. So I'm hoping to understand if there's any space for complementary work. Like they're a team of 130 plus people. Maybe they can do things at a scale that we can't, but there are nuances that are important that we can are maybe more nimble or capable of contributing. I guess I'm saying this to say what I think my prior expectation is, even though I'm afraid it's just colored by the fact that I don't think of NREL as a very open lab. Like I don't feel like them plus academics is often a space of like win-win. It seems like for some reason to me it's been more of a like zero-sum game, but I don't have a lot of experience with them. I think more people on this team do than I do. I'm just sharing, I guess, in the spirit of transparency before we head in the meeting.
I don't have more experience, Ellison. And I think that there have been times when I shared your opinion, not just about NREL, but about other government labs, that there's some ways in which universities and labs are competitive. I learned, let's see, there was a follow-up call with the on that meeting this week, and I learned that they one of the projects that was presented in that meeting, the Permian Basin, which I think I mentioned. So there's a big Permian Basin project that was talking about advanced energy, had community engagement, was looking at workforce, and they were thinking about advanced energy in a very much different way than people often talk about it, because it's a big fossil fuel production. And so one of the things that they were exploring was how to make energy jobs more stable. That's a little bit of background, but I just learned a couple days ago that a project, an NSF engines project, which is like, I don't know how big, in the tens of millions, that included leads from universities and NREL, was funded. And so there is currently examples of cooperation, but I think your question about, okay, what do we provide that their, 130 person machine is not just going to eat, right? I think that's it's a reasonable one, and it's underlying, like, okay, what's the role of universities, right? What is the comparative advantage of universities? Is there one? But I would rather address that question openly, whether it's openly among us or openly with them. And just acknowledge that, like, I don't want to go in a direction where I'm going to develop something and then somebody's just going to overrun it. So yeah, so that's, I agree with you. I share your caution, but I always think that more information is better, even if you don't like what you're hearing.
Agreed.
This
Yeah.
is entirely self-serving in some ways, but I'm somewhat curious to hear just their perspective on things. So my students always want to work at NREL, and we placed a lot of students there, but like, to me, I would like for this project to know, if I'm hiring students to work on it, like, how do they need to be trained to get jobs somewhere like that? And it's a little weird for a project, but I'm very curious about it.
I think it's quite reasonable, Ryan. I have students who are the same. And I think if we have a good relationship with them and a good placement relationship with them, it's attractive for students to recruit them.
Yeah, like, even if we don't get to work on the project with them, like, having a relationship so I can recommend, hey, look at this student. I would love that. That would be amazing.
Yeah, agree. Okay, I want to close now. Does anyone have any last things that they want to bring forward? Okay, everyone, we'll see a lot of you on Monday, and have a great weekend. Thanks. Bye.